For the artwork section of this video, we're going to jump into the computer. Now I'm on a Mac, but of course you can also use a PC. Whether you're using a Mac or a PC, there are a few things that you want to think about when picking a computer for handling screen printing artwork. First is you want a good amount of memory, 8 gigabytes of RAM or higher. Second is you want a dedicated graphics card. You also want a good processor, of course, but these two things are key to handling large files for screen printing, as well as having multiple programs open at the same time, such as Illustrator and Photoshop. Now let's talk about art. When it comes to screen printed t-shirts, I did a random Google search for screen printed t-shirts and pulled up the images to illustrate the different types of art that's used in the screen printing process. The majority of the art that's used in screen printing is called vector art. This is simple logos, 1-2 color designs, something like this, text on a shirt, a 2-color text on a shirt, or a logo of a company. There's also raster art, which is more complex, like this piece of art right here. This is a full color design using multiple colors and gradient effects with a lot of high detail. As we scroll down through the page, we notice that a lot of the art is simple 1-2 color vector artwork. We are going to deal with both types of artwork in this video, however. The artwork that we're going to be printing today is both vector and raster. This is the art that we're going to be handling. It's a 2-color vector piece of art. It's a logo that we're going to be handling in Illustrator in vector format. And this is the piece of art that we're going to be handling in a raster format in Photoshop. Since the majority of the art that is printed is vector artwork, we're going to start here. There are 2 different types of programs you can use for vector artwork. Since I'm on a Mac, I'm going to be using Adobe Illustrator, but you can also use CorelDRAW if you're a PC user or if you're using a PC platform on a Mac, such as Boot Camp. The great thing about vector artwork is you can make it as big or as small as you want. And as you can see, the edge quality is amazing. If we look over at our raster artwork, if I zoom in, the edge quality degrades. It looks fine from afar, but you can see how chunky it is up close. That's why we want to handle most of our logo and text artwork in the computer in a vector format. And for this video, once again, we're going to be using Illustrator. Let's say a customer gave me this piece of artwork. It's probably not screen print ready. First of all, we want to set up our canvas. You can either set up a blank canvas by going to open up a new board. Typically, I recommend setting your canvas up to the size of your film, so 13 by 19 is our average film size using our Epson 1430 printer. However, you can also use a canvas that's on top of a t-shirt template. This is a t-shirt template you can download for free from our website. That's a part of our vector t-shirt template package. What I did is I set up my 13 by 19 film size and then I overlaid that on top of the t-shirt template. This is my approximate t-shirt image area right here in the center, which I will use to design in. Fortunately, this art is already in vector format. If a customer gave you a piece of art that wasn't in vector format, you'd want to make that into a vector format object. Right here, we have the same artwork but not in vector format. This is in raster format. So if a customer gave this JPEG to us and we need to vectorize it, we have a few different options. We can do an image trace or a vectorized image option in Illustrator or Photoshop. Some images like this are pretty easy to do. However, if you are dealing with more complex images, we would recommend using a vectorizing service. You can get this done for pretty cheap, typically around $12 an image, and they turn around in about a day or so. This takes out all the hard work. One good place to look is copyartwork.com that does this service. There are also a ton of great videos on YouTube on how to vectorize yourself. For the purposes of this DVD, our artwork is already in vector format. So the first thing I'm going to do is going to take this artwork directly to my canvas. So I'm copying the entire piece of artwork over to my t-shirt template right here. There we go. Before I start, I'm going to turn on my guides. Turn on your guides, you go to your view, and then you go to Smart Guides. That'll give us a center line and different guides that we can actually pull around and use in this piece of artwork. Once my guides are in place, we want to center and size the artwork. So I'm going to highlight this art by holding the Shift key down. Once it's all highlighted together, I'm going to group it so I can move it in one. Before I do this, however, you notice my document setup's in pixels or points right now, and I want to change that to inches so I can have a relative mark on the t-shirt. So I go to my document setup and I go to change that to inches. From here on out, I can now see how large this is in terms of inches. We're going to want about an 11-inch print right here, maybe just slightly small, 11.2, that'll work good. Now notice, you don't want to skew this art, so I'm holding my Shift key down as I'm making this smaller and larger. That's an 11-inch piece of artwork right there. It's centered and ready to go. Now we have to separate it. Now if this was a simple one-color logo, it would be pretty simple. We could just come in here and color the entire logo black. But since it's not, we actually have to color it in a Pantone color. So this is going to go on a dark garment, meaning that we need 2 colors. But we need to have an entire white underbase and then a red overprint. In order to do this, we're going to use a Pantone color. Illustrator and CorelDRAW use Pantone color in order to see the different colors in an image and print those different colors on different films so that you can then screen print them. I'm going to go over to my color swatches and I'm going to open up a color book. Now, once again, we're going to be using a Pantone color book. So I'm going to go to my color books and I'm going to be using a Pantone solid coated color book. This opens up all the different color options in my color book, and I'm going to keep this open and maybe even just pull it over to the side there just so I can have this in the future. So here are all my different options for color. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create our white underbase. In order to do that, we're going to ungroup this. Now we can handle the bottom and the top separately, all as individual vector components. First of all, I'm going to copy the bottom red so that I can make two elements of that. So I copy that and I pulled that down to the bottom. Now I'm going to regroup the top because this is all going to be our white underbase. Next we have to come over here and we have to select a white. Typically I end up, so I can see it, especially on different colors of garments, using a light gray as a white. So that's going to represent our white print. This is now a Pantone color, and Illustrator can actually see this as a different color of film. Next we're going to bring back up the red and place it. Illustrator and CorelDRAW does a pretty good job of placing it directly on top of the underbase. But you want to zoom in to make sure that you've placed it without seeing anything on the side. This looks great. Now what we have set up here is what's called butt-to-butt registration, meaning that our screen has to be perfect in order for this red not to show the white behind it. That's probably not going to work very well. So we need to do a couple different things to this. The first thing that we have to do is we have to come in and pick out a Pantone red. So I'm just going to use a standard Pantone red for this. That's a nice bright red. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to add a stroke. This is my stroke layer. I'm going to select red as a stroke. Now it adds red all the way around the top. So you have 1 pixel of stroke on the outside. You probably don't want an entire pixel. I typically select about a half pixel. The reason why you select a little bit smaller pixel on the outside is if you have too big a stroke on the outside, you have a problem because you can actually have a little bit of a blurriness on your print and it doesn't look very crisp. So now I have my underbase and my overprint. However, Illustrator and CorelDRAW could not see the white that's underneath the red unless I do something. So I'm going to open up my Windows and I'm going to open up my Attributes menu. My Attributes menu allows me to add what's called an overprint stroke and an overprint fill. If I select those two features, what I can now see is both the white on the bottom and the red on top. Let's illustrate this. To look at this a little bit better, we're going to look at our separations preview. So we go to our window and we select separations preview. Now your document mode has to be in CMYK color in order to look at this. We're not printing with CMYK here, so I'm going to turn all of that off. We're going to look at our red overprint. We can see the red right there and the gray underneath. And then if I zoom in, the red should be slightly larger than the gray. Right, there's the gray. The red is slightly larger. This is good to print. Illustrator and CorelDRAW handle separation preview a little bit differently. CorelDRAW does it in the print menu. Illustrator does it on screen. The last thing that we're going to do is add some registration marks. Now I like adding registration marks manually. So we actually have a template that once again you can download from our website in the resources guide in this video that actually gives you registration marks. So I'm going to open up my registration mark template right here. And I'm going to copy in one of the registration marks. Over here, I'm going to now place that registration mark up on the top center line right there. You got to make sure it's centered very, very closely. So it's centered right in the middle there. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to color this registration mark a very specific color. Once I have this selected, I want to color this a registration color. A registration color actually allows me to see this on every single film. Once I have that there, I'm going to make sure this is grouped, and then I'm going to copy that and put one down at the bottom. Once again, in the center line. Very, very important that's in the center line. You want to make sure this is far enough away from your image that it's not in the ink area, and that you can make sure that you have enough room to tape that off. Once everything is colored, we have registration marks, it's now time to print films. Printing films out of Illustrator is actually fairly simple. We simply go to the print menu. Since we separated the proper way, we need to have the proper printer and the proper rip in order to handle that. AccuRip is a PostScript processor that allows Illustrator and CorelDRAW to see Pantone color separations. If you do not have AccuRip, we'll talk about a different way you can actually color separate, but since this is the proper way to do it for screen printing, we're going to be using AccuRip. Next thing we have to do is we have to come and set up our document size. So we go over to our page setup size. We're going to be selecting our Super A3, which is the 13 by 19 size. Now we can see here we have our image previewed in Illustrator. We want to make sure that everything is defined by the driver here and we have everything set up ready to go. Next we go to marks and bleed. We actually don't need any marks and bleed. We don't need any marks and bleed because we actually have this already down. If you're doing high detail work in Photoshop, you can add color bars, which adds the gradient scale on the bottom. But typically you don't need that. You can use registration marks in Illustrator, but it doesn't give you a center mark, and the most important registration mark is a center mark because you can center everything, as you'll find out in the rest of this video. So we're not going to use any of this. What we are going to use is the output setting. Instead of printing the composite, we're going to print the separations. Now remember, we're only going to print two of those separations, and that's going to be our red separation and our Pantone gray separation. Let's open AccuRip to make sure our settings are correct in AccuRip as well. AccuRip is a PostScript processor that enables a standard Epson inkjet printer to print film positives, read vector data, and print halftones. It also controls your ink settings. So if I have my AccuRip set up to my Epson 1430 printer, I want to make sure that my size is set to 13 by 19 as well, and I want to select my multi-black mode. This is using the Black Max system. My halftone configuration is not relevant for this actual print because there are no halftones, so we'll leave that as our standard settings for now. Once everything is set here, we confirmed our print size, we go back over to Illustrator and simply hit print. This will rip to AccuRip and we'll see in our print AccuRip menu. Doing things properly like we laid out here makes coloring and separating artwork very simple because you build the separation from the ground up. If you don't have that option, however, you want to simplify life a little bit. If I didn't have AccuRip, this is how I would separate the same piece of art. Now we'd still want our art in vector format. Here it is in vector format. It's centered directly on the page. Now we need to convert everything to black. So we'll come over here and convert the entire underbase to black. Now we just use any normal black because we don't actually have to use separations here. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to create our overprint. So we're going to copy our registration marks and we're going to copy the underneath part. Next we're going to bring that down to the bottom of the film. So this is actually on the same film positive. So on the same film positive, we'll center that up, give the center lines. We have our underprint and then we have our overprint. Now over here, we do have to add that stroke. So we're going to add that stroke back in as a black stroke. So this is actually the different way that you can do that. Now if I go to print and I don't have AccuRip, what I can do is go to my standard Epson 1430 printer. I can define the page size as my same 13 by 19 size right here, and I can print, instead of the output printing some separations, I'm printing the composite, which is just the black image. So that's two different ways we can separate the same image. Once again, the proper way to do it, especially as you get into more complex vector images, is to do it the way we started with, using the Pantone solid coded colors, doing the overprint fill, and then doing AccuRip separations to the print menu. The other way you can do it is by simply coloring them black and layering them and separating them out manually like you see here. In this scenario, we can't actually see what's going to happen until we get on press. So that's why the first scenario works just a little bit better. Now that we've handled our vector artwork, let's jump over to Photoshop and handle our raster artwork. Photoshop is a great program for screen printers who are dealing with full color images and gradient details. These images are typically photographs or some type of hand-drawn illustration that are not computer generated to begin with. As we open this image up, it's very important to handle it two different ways. First, always handle in RGB mode unless we go into CMYK separation. CMYK separation is great for full color images, and there's an entire other video series on CMYK printing and simulated process printing. Next, we always want to look at our image size. To find out the image size, we go to Image and then Image Size. This gives us the size of the image in width of inches as well as the resolution. Resolution is very important when it comes to raster images. Typically, you want at least 200 dpi. Another thing to take into consideration, you cannot increase the resolution here by simply changing this from 250 to 300. 300 is optimal, by the way. So you can never go bigger. You can always go smaller. So if you have 600 dpi and you just have too much information or the image is too large, you can change that to 300 dpi, but you can never go larger. Be careful of 72 dpi images. That's typically what you would get out of Google. You can get decent images with halftones because keep in mind halftones are chunking that up even more, but the better quality you have to begin with, the better. 200 dpi or higher is optimal. So something like this, let's say we want to turn this into a one color gradient print. Well, it's actually pretty easy to do. First of all, I'm going to have the entire thing brought up. Now this is not screen print ready because if I just hit print, it would see red in there. It wouldn't print the proper red or gradient on the film in that direction, and it would print a negative of this design. If I want this design to show up white ink on a black background the way it's illustrated right here, I have to change that. There are a few different ways I can actually go about doing that. First of all, I'm going to get rid of the red. So I'm going to go to my Image tab in my Adjustments. This is the majority of what you're going to use as a screen print in Illustrator, Image and Adjustments. Sometimes you use layers, sometimes you use filters or selections, but typically you're in your Image menu. Now, unlike Illustrator, where we want to be in CMYK mode so we can see the separations, in Photoshop, until we actually go to CMYK printing, which is a whole nother series of videos, and that is great, by the way, if you want to get into complex artwork, we're going to be in RGB mode. RGB mode allows us to see more color and vibrance in the artwork in Photoshop, and that's why we want to handle it in that menu. To get this down to a one color, I simply go to my adjustments and I desaturate. This gets rid of all my color altogether. Now to handle this as a positive instead of a negative, I have a few different options. First, I can go in here and I can invert it. So I go to my adjustments and I invert this. This turns all the white to black and all the black to white. This is now a film positive. Now if I print this film, I can actually see this reversed on the film. So if I print whiting through that film, I'm going to have the same image that we started out on. The second thing I can do is I can actually color range out or pull out the white in this design. This allows me to actually make another channel for separations. To do this, we simply select our magic wand tool. This is a tool that's also used quite often. And then we're going to use what's called the color range option. The color range option allows me to pick and pull in all the different white in image. So if I choose true white in this image, I can pull in white in all the different gradients. Once that's selected, once again, we're going to be creating a film positive here, not a film negative. So I'm going to go over to the image and I'm going to invert that so I can pull out just the black areas of the image. Now that that's selected, you'll see these little tiny marching ants pop up around everywhere. Now I can go to Save Selection as a new channel, and this is my white. So over here, I can see that I've pulled out all of the gray. Now, if you look at the natural inversion of the image, we probably have a little bit more data. This would probably screen print pretty well, but since I'm not super versed in how to separate out of Photoshop, for this particular print, I'm going to actually maintain the integrity of the image if I simply go to invert. So there's one option right there, and then you can see the other option. You can definitely see I did not capture as much data here. Now this would screen print obviously, but this one would screen print a little bit better. Now in order to print a design like this, we absolutely have to have a RIP software. This is Tonal Work. The only way to print a design like this without a RIP software is to desaturate it completely and take all the halftones out of that. If you don't have RIP software and you want to use images in Photoshop, you want to add a threshold to that. That takes all the halftones out of it. Once again, it kind of looks like the original image, and we can change the density there. Kind of gives it a cool punk rock look, and this is actually how we created a lot of our punk rock shirts back in the day when I started screen printing. However, if we want to capture the tones, we want to leave that in there, and then we're going to use a RIP software to do that. So before we go to our print menu, let's go back over to AccuRip and set up our RIP. When it comes to the ability to print halftones, AccuRip takes a gradient line, which is what a standard Epson printer would read, and converts it into a dot matrix. So this line right here would start out very light gray and go to very dark gray, but it would start out with very small dots and go to very large dots. The dots in AccuRip pull on the percentage of black that you're actually separating. So this was 100% black down here, there would be no dots right here. If this was 100% white up here, there would be no dots up here. If this was 50% gray right here, the dot size would be 50% of the entire dot size right here. So here's a real good illustration of what AccuRip physically does when it comes to creating halftones. In AccuRip, however, you have to choose what's called the halftone LPI, or lines per inch. Lines per inch is very similar to DPI. So if you go to Edit Configuration and go to my configuration setup right here, I choose my frequency or my LPI. 55 lines per inch means there's 55 halftone lines per every inch area. If this was 1 inch area and I counted these lines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, this would be a 15 LPI halftone. Typically, AccuRip is set to a 45 LPI default. Now, when it comes to screen mesh, there's a simple equation. You take your LPI and you times it by 5. That equals your minimum screen mesh. So if I take 45 times 5, that would be a 225 or a 230 mesh screen, which is actually what we're going to be using for this. So our default setting in AccuRip is perfect for this. However, if I wanted to go up to a higher LPI, which is smaller dots, which would equal higher detail, I would need to put that on finer screen mesh. So I'm going to take 45 LPI up to 55 LPI. 55 times 5 is 275, which means I need to be on a 280 or 305 mesh if I wanted to hold that detail. For this video, I'm going to stick with 45 LPI. Here you can see how 45 LPI actually would relate to the screen mesh. If our dot gets too small, we would lose that halftone dot. This is a plenty big dot to hit on this screen mesh. So 35 hits a 195 mesh or a 200 mesh, no problem. 55, once again, as we just illustrated, would be too small. So for this right here, we have set it to 45 LPI, and we're going to be printing on 230 mesh screens. When looking at the different LPI options in AccuRip under the Edit configuration, there's typically 3 types of art I would typically recommend. First is lower end vector art, going on athletic gear or simple vector designs. Let's say the Lava logo, for instance, had some gradients in it like you see here. That would be done with 35 line LPI, maybe a 30 line LPI, but going on a lower mesh 110 to 156 mesh screen because we're going on a dark garment or directly to an underbase. The second is the image that we have here. That's the AccuRip default setting at 45 line LPI. So 45 line LPI is great for 230 mesh and medium artwork on light and dark garments, like this design will be going on. Finally, would be 55 LPI or higher. This would be for 4-color process printing, which we'll deal with in another video series, or for extremely high detail prints on 305 mesh or higher. For this design, when we go to print it, we select File and Print. We're on a 13 by 19 piece of film. So we want to select our AccuRip to Epson printer, and we want to go to our print settings. Next, we want to choose our paper size. Once again, 13 by 19 Super B, hit Save. We do want some other information. Of course we want our center crop marks, but we also want some postscript options. Postscript options allows us to have calibration bars, which essentially gives us a gradient scale that allows us to evaluate our halftone retention during exposure. We'll review this during the exposure section. Definitely want to add those calibration bars, center crop marks. If you're doing more than one color on the separation, add your labels because that'll give us the color that we're actually going to print. Next, we simply hit print. It will rip and print to our film positive.